All right, it's 4 minutes after noon, so I think we will go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for the uh, return of the Minnesota Turkey Growers Association educational webinars. Up first today is Adriaan Dokter with the BirdCast group. So Adriaan, if you'd like to get started, introduce yourself and get started with your presentation. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function if any of our attendees have any questions. I will now turn it over to Adriaan.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so my name is Adriaan Dokter. I'm a researcher here at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I'm the project lead here for the BirdCast project. So let me start with sharing my screen. I'll give you first a little introduction of what the BirdCast project is and how it maybe is helpful to in your work. Yeah, so BirdCast is actually it's a project that follows the migration of wild birds, and sort of in a way as the weather reports you on incoming weather. The BirdCast project really tries to follow bird migration as it happens. And we have a variety of tools that allow you to follow migration as it happens, and also to forecast when bird migration will come your way. So the project has been around for about 15 years, and I think when you think about BirdCast, in its inception, it was really a research project. In our field is kind of called aeroecology, which means the study of the airspace, and in particular the airspace in the sense of how birds and also insects move through that airspace. And we use remote sensing techniques, mostly radar, to follow migratory birds as they move through the air. And using those sort of innovative data products, we make also tools that people can use. So there's forecasts, there's visualizations where you can see where in the airspace above the US birds are moving at any given time. And we like really to have those tools to have conservation and societal impact. So here's an example of Lights Out, which has been a kind of a focus for us for the last few years. Like big, bright skyscrapers, they tend to attract birds at night and they collide with these skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are not always happy to turn off their lights to prevent these collisions, but because we are now able to sort of tell you when and where birds will migrate and on which specific nights, it allows us to people to really respond in a more dynamic way to migratory birds. So BirdCast, we really try to have like diverse societal impacts. So artificial light at night, I mentioned, renewable energy in aviation or other areas where birds collide, but also avian-borne disease spread. We have quite detailed information on when, where, and along which routes birds are moving. And that can really help you potentially to track also how avian flu and other diseases might be spread around by migratory birds, and sort of when the risk of infection into a farm, for example, is highest when a lot of birds are on the move. Also, conservation and education of the general public is very much a focus of our work. So I have to disclose, I'm not an expert on avian influenza. I'm really come to this from the sort of bird movement side of things. But we've thought a lot, and we've gotten a lot of requests of like, how can BirdCast products be used to maybe inform farmers about what's happening on their farm, especially now that H5N1 strands are becoming more and more common. You probably are more aware of this more than me, but also the sort of spread this year by dairy cattle. And it's a very complex process where spread goes from wild birds to dairy cattle and into mammalian species back to birds. So to really say what's the cause and the main cause of the spread is still hotly debated. But I think it's fair to say that wild birds do play a role in the sort of global spread of these virus strands. And in that component of like the spread of wild birds, that's sort of something I think where BirdCast can potentially contribute something. So BirdCast is a main source of the data we use is radar data. Radar is an acronym for radio detection and ranging. It basically, we use these very big weather radars that also are used to track storms and hurricanes in the US. They survey the full airspace, but they don't only detect they don't only detect weather, they also detect migratory birds. So this is a composite, sort of the raw data of what these networks provide. So you see the storm system moving towards the east, and then behind it you see all these blooms, sort of circular blooms appearing. And those are really the migratory birds that are taking off all at the same time, right at sunset. That's why it appears so abruptly. Um, and you can see there's a lot of noise in these images, a lot of precipitation. And what the BirdCast projects kind of does for you is sort of extract the bird information and present it in a way that you can interact with it, and also in a way that we can forecast what happens with these data, with these bird movements. So these weather radars, they have been around for like over 25 years, and there's very large archives of data on these bird movements. And that really allows you to also, with these enormous data sets, you can really build predictive models to also forecast when migration will happen before it actually happens, and it allows you to potentially respond to it. So this is like one of the observations that BirdCast is making. So we extracted here the birds for one given night, and you see again that yellow and black and red lines are the sunset terminators, so when sunset and sunrise happens. So one thing is very obvious, right? That the migration really peaks and really starts in the dark when the sunset has started. And birds really like, by most species, really like to migrate under the cover of darkness, which makes it also such a hidden phenomenon and something you don't obviously see. Well, in fact, there is millions and millions of birds moving every night over your head. So just to put that in perspective, here I calculated it for these sort of two borders, like the Canadian and the southern border, approximately, with these blue and yellow lines. So we have Montana over here. It's kind of still pretty close to the main flyway of migratory birds, which runs through the center of the country. And we have a lot of birds sort of moving sort of westward, I mean, towards the boreal forests, also the prairie potholes, where a lot of water birds are molting and breeding. So an important migration area. If you calculate on how many birds are you talking about, it's a huge, huge number. So across these lines in spring, there's about 3.5 billion birds coming into the US, about 2.5 billion birds moving out of the US, and many more billions of birds moving inside the US. So it's huge. In the fall, typically numbers are even better, larger, because then we have all the new recruits and the new birds that are being born in the summer that join the migration. So you typically see almost 4 to 4.5 billion birds then crossing these lines. So it's not, there's a real magnitude of birds. And we see, I talked already, most of them migrate at night. There's various reasons for that. It's cooler, but it's just an efficient use of your time because birds can forage during the day, for which they need their eyesight. And then at night, they can spend their time migrating. So it's a very efficient way of moving at night. The atmosphere tends to be stable, and there's no predators that can see them. And of course, there's all these cues like the sun and the moon and the stars that birds can use to navigate. So we typically see that almost all migration, or like 90% of it, happens under the cover of darkness. So what we do in the BirdCast project is like sort of use all these historical radar observations that we have of birds in the airspace, And then we take weather models, basically the weather forecast models that also being used to generate the weather. And we sort of learn these associations between weather parameters like wind and temperature and wind direction, humidity, and so on the one hand, and you learn the associations with the bird migration densities that we see in the air. And you have to know, like, birds are very good weather forecasters, and they just really like to move when they have a good tailwind and when they can move efficiently. So what we typically find is that weather is a super good predictor of bird movements. So what we then do is once we have trained a model that learns these associations of like which weather conditions are associated with strong migrations, we can just feed these models new data, basically the forecast, the weather forecast of a few days in the future, and then predict what kind of migration we are expecting. And then that way we generate these migration forecasts that sort of tell you when and where bird migration is going to happen a few days in advance. And this works very well. So I owe my colleagues Benjamin Van Doren and Kyle Horton, who are now at Colorado State University and the University of Illinois, put a lot of work in this forecasting work. So some credits to them. And yeah, here's an example of such a forecast for the night of May 3rd. So all the bright colors predict a lot of migration. This is then the actual observation that we did at that forecasted time. And you can see already, if I toggle back and forth, it really gets these main patterns are forecasted quite accurately. So that's one of our main products, and there's more of them, and I'll give a little overview in a minute. But so BirdCast gives you these products. On the one hand, there's forecasts and alerts for when migration is going to happen, which we have up to 3 days in advance. And on the other hand, you can follow migration and look at it as it happens through the radar network. Look at the live migration as it unfolds in a few different ways. So and then on top of that, we recently have a new tool which is called the Migration Dashboard, which is for the more scientific, or if you really want to dig into the data. And we have a little demo here that shows you. Not sure if the sound works with. So that gives you a bit of a sneak preview, and I thought what I'll do now is maybe move my screens and just show you in a sort of a demo of how you can use these tools and how they might be useful. So let me share my other screen here, which is just my website. I hope this shows up. Yeah, so if you come to the BirdCast website, there's a whole bunch of tools, and I think there's a lot of information there. And I think maybe the simplest information, and I think might be useful to you, is these migration forecast maps. So here we have a map of a certain area, and basically of the whole of the US. And it tells you like how many birds are being predicted and in which areas we are expecting migration. And you can look at for tonight, for tomorrow, and for the day after tomorrow. We're already entering a bit of the tail of the migration, and especially on Montana, I think peak migration has really passed. But if you really want to even simplify the information, you can also just type here in the local bird migration alerts. You can find your city of interest. So let's do, for example, Billings, Montana. And that gives you a very simplified version of what to expect in the next few days. So a very simple scoring for the next 3 days, whether migration will be low, medium, or high for your area. So as I said, we're a bit past migration already in Montana, so all the forecasts are low for the next 3 days. Where I am here currently in Ithaca, New York, things are different. So tonight we have a big migration push forecasted. So you see these high migration alerts. The next 3 days it will be medium. You'll notice that our forecasts are currently targeted a little bit towards the issue of lights out, but I think that you might just as well use them for maybe any activities on your farm, or maybe bringing birds, preventing them from exposure from wild birds during these peak movements, if you would want to. So I think this is a helpful way of using forecasts. At the same time, you can also, if you're more of the real, if you want to go a little bit deeper and want to explore sort of what are the general migration periods in your area, you can also use the migration dashboard that I showed a little movie for. So let's say we go to the state of Montana here. That gives you here for the current year now what has happened, and for the last night what has happened in terms of migration. So these left 3 panels tell you information about last night's migration, and these panels here in the middle tell you about what has happened so far this season. So you see these green peaks, like migration is very episodic. Sometimes we have big movement nights when birds have a good tailwind. Other nights there's really no movement at all. So it's very typical to see that sort of very spiky behavior of very big movement nights followed by nights with almost nothing. The gray line in the back gives you this sort of multi-season average of when migration happens. So you see in Montana, it starts sort of early August, and sort of early October, migration is pretty much over. So this is helpful if you're kind of more interested in sort of setting a window of risk, and want to see sort of what is the peak periods of migration. You can sort of eyeball that here, like what are the main movements. If you're very interested, and you can almost use this as a detective or a scientific tool, or you can, I'm very interested in these things. I can almost sort of go bird watching behind my computer using this tool. There's so much to see in like how many birds are in flight, the directions and their speeds and the altitudes, their flight altitudes. I think some of this information is probably too detailed for your use case, but it's definitely interesting. And we tell you also something about like which expected nocturnal migrants will be moving for any given time in your area. And that sort of all adjusts depending on when you are looking. So we would go to spring. We would have a different set of nocturnal migrants that's then moving around. And you see also here you can read off the peak migration periods, which are sort of from early May to early June in Montana. So that's the migration dashboard. And then and I think this is also just because I'm sort of showing you all the features. This is also a kind of a fun little tool where we can look for last night's migration, where migration was, and the flight directions of the birds. So this was for last night. You see not too much movements in Montana, but lots of movement still in the east. Good movement here with birds mostly moving towards the south, west, as you can see by the little arrows. So lots of lots of information. I'm gonna now switch back again to my other presentation. Um, So I hope that has given you a bit of an overview of like what BirdCast can tell you and how you can use these weather sort of these migration forecasts. Oh, um, I also because I was giving you stuff, I thought it might be helpful to really give you sort of these actual dates of when peak migration season is in the state of Montana. So when the really typically migration peaks in a fairly short period, and sort of 50% of the movement happens in a relatively short period each year. So on average, we see that in spring, almost half of the bird movements happens between May 1 and May 19. And in the fall, it happens sort of on between August 28 and September 23rd. So in that window, 50% of the movement happens. So you have the like sort of already half the movements for a fairly short period of only like 2.5, 3 weeks. So that's good to know, right? Like the really maybe move areas when birds are really moving around is relatively short. If you want to include the full migration season, so sort of 95% of the movements, they happen, of course, over a longer period. So you see in Montana, that is in spring from March 14 to June 1st. That's when 95% of the movements happen. And in fall, that happens at the end of July towards October 19. So those are longer periods. But I thought that might also be helpful for you to know, like, when are these really peak movements. And these data you can find in the dashboard, and they're also listed on our website. Also happy to share. And of course, I'm also happy to hear from you. We are always interested in feedback on our migration tools. And I'm curious to hear like what kind of information would be most helpful to your users and to farmers to help reduce the spat. Like what kind of information would you ideally want, and like does that work for you, this sort of dynamic responding towards migration alerts, or is it much more useful to have like these fixed windows of when you want to be careful with exposing poultry to maybe potentially wild birds? Those are all things that we are interested to hear as we sort of sketch the future of the project and see what sort of how we can be most useful to different types of users. Um, so that's what I had, and yeah, happy to answer any questions if they are here. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Adrian. Do we have any questions from the group? Feel free to unmute yourself and just shout them out. We've got nothing in the question and answer panel. So if not, I think we can move on. We will include your contact information and some of the information we send out about this, if that's all right.
Sure.
We appreciate you coming on today. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks.
All right. Up next is Dr. Shauna Voss with the Board of Animal Health. She's going to talk about some of the work the USDA did this summer and then give us a disease update.
Thank you, Peter. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I am.
All right. So I'm going to dive right in first of all with talking about the H5N1 situation in dairy cattle, and then I'll move on to talking about some of the epidemiological work that has been done here in the state and across the US. And then, as Peter mentioned, I'll wrap things up by giving a little update on other things besides this that are happening in Minnesota. So as you guys are probably all aware, this mystery illness in dairy cattle first started showing up in the media and kind of through the rumor mill back in February, where producers in the Texas Panhandle were reporting a mystery illness in dairy cattle that caused a drop in milk production and changes to that milk, and just overall kind of not doing well signs within those dairy cattle. And it didn't take too long before herds in Kansas and New Mexico began reporting some of the same symptoms. And so eventually, the cause was determined to be H5N1, a very similar virus to the high path strains that we are unfortunately all too familiar with in our poultry. That was first confirmed in March or on March 25th, 2024. And it was determined to be this new genetic clade called B313. And that's the genetic clade that is currently circulating only in dairy cattle. After much discussion about what it was going to be called, it started off being called high path in cattle. The terminology that was settled on was H5N1 influenza in dairy cattle. And this is considered a spillover event with this high path strain into dairy cattle. So unfortunately, by the time the virus was identified, there was likely already lots of movements of animals out of Texas into and across the United States. And so this map doesn't represent the actual movements, but it kind of shows the distance and degree to which the movements can occur in a very short period of time. And so H5N1 in livestock, what does this actually look like, and you know, what's being done about it? Right now, it's considered an emerging disease. So as you guys are well aware, that's not treated the same way as high path avian influenza, which is still considered a foreign animal disease in poultry. The clinical picture in livestock results in a pretty sudden drop in milk production, and that milk may become thickened or even colostrum-like. And across the herd, as that virus spreads through, you can have a pretty significant herd level milk production drop. The cows themselves may run a fever, they may go off feed, they otherwise are doing very poorly. A lot of vets will report that there's a decrease in rumen motility, changes to their feces, and just overall lethargy and dehydration as is associated with fevers. The milk production in these animals usually does recover, but it's been reported that they may not return to 100% production. As you are aware, this virus was eventually found in Minnesota. We had our first confirmed dairy herd in Minnesota on June 4th, 2024. And this graph that's on the screen here is pulled off of our website from when we've had other detections. We ultimately ended up identifying 9 positive herds through about the middle of July. Those cases were identified in Benton County, Stearns County, Morrison, Candy, Ojai, Sibley, and Lincoln County. And that yellow arrow that I have on the graph is when we had our first case in poultry with this B313. And so, you know, I'll talk about it later on, but clearly that virus was circulating in Minnesota well before we've had our first detection in dairy cattle. So I'm going to move on to some epidemiological investigation information. And I just want to mention to everybody that I'm presenting on this work and findings that were conducted by others. So the Board of Animal Health and myself was not directly involved in these investigations. We did request that a group of USDA epidemiologists come in and to have some boots on the ground in Minnesota when we brought in our incident management blue and indigo teams this summer. And we requested that assistance to help see if we could determine introduction and spread of that H5N1 virus in dairies. Unfortunately, due to some limitations in our regulatory authority, a lot of additional testing associated with those investigation efforts were restricted. So the information presented here is a summary of Minnesota EPI work as well as EPI work that was conducted in other states. So when USDA comes in to do some surveillance and epidemiological activity, they do take a multi-pronged approach. And some of the things that they do is they will go and administer and do some evaluations of epidemiological questionnaires and the findings from those questionnaires. They do sometimes go on farm and do sampling and other further investigations. When appropriate or when they find evidence, they will sample some wild birds, rodents, or other animals. And then they do incorporate the evaluation of genetic sequencing of all of these isolates that are obtained to help paint that big picture. So during on-site interviews, the team does look at the general layout of these farms and how close those farms are to other farms, including poultry premises or dairy farms or even other livestock types of operations. They will look at how the feed and bedding is being stored, what the water source is for that farm, and then where the lagoon or manure storage pits are located and how long that manure is stored before removal. They also make sure that they are looking at how waste milk from these dairies are being disposed of, because that seems to be a pretty high risk level, knowing how much virus is in that waste milk. And then they will also look at how the animals are housed, and if there are other animals on that farm and if they are impacted. The EPIs will also ask a series of questions that try to paint a picture of movements on or off that farm, and that includes movements of cattle, people, equipment, and wild animals. So they ask questions about daily farm activities, including cattle movements and other traffic on and off that farm, such as deliveries, vendors, or visitors. They might look at employee living situations and other jobs or work that those staff on site may hold in that livestock industry. They also ask questions to establish the timeline of disease progression and clinical signs. So when were mortality seen? Were there any abortions? Well, when did fever start? When did milk production drop? And then what class of animals are sick? So are these young animals? Are they, later in their lactation cycle? And then what are the biosecurity measures for any shared trucks, trailers, people on and off of that site? The whole interview process takes about 2.5 to 3 hours, and then the EPIs do submit a report to the USDA with the findings to be included in the national study of emerging pictures. And these are the same EPI investigations that are conducted on every dairy farm and almost every poultry farm that's infected with high path. So this slide shows the timeline for all high path avian influenza cases overlaid with the H5N1 cases, and it's laid out by date or onset of clinical signs. And so the blue lines across the top of the graph represent our poultry cases. Our chicken in our backyard flocks are on the bottom in gray, and then all of the yellow lines are our dairy cases. And as I mentioned, we know that B313 virus arrived in Minnesota likely prior to April 9th, which is based on when we had our first detection in our commercial poultry operations, and that's that Meeker 13 case. The spread of H5N1 between states is linked to cattle movement, so the virus was likely introduced into Minnesota early April or even late March, potentially even before that original March 25th detection date confirmed by USDA. The EPIs will also look at the viral genomics of all of the isolates that are identified, whether it be in poultry or dairy cattle or even wild animals, to try to understand how they're related. And so the sequencing data that we have on both the poultry cases and our dairy cases indicated that virus originated or had some origins from herds that were in Kansas and South Dakota. A lot of their cases were clustered together by relatedness. And while that kind of helps to paint the picture of how those viruses are related and potential spread, it doesn't explain how the virus is moving, but it does help to kind of show that farm to farm and geographical relationship of each of these cases. And it's just really important to note that, especially in Minnesota, we had a lot of untested dairy farms, and that leaves gaps in that overall picture for how those viruses are detected and moving about on the landscape. And I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but this is information that was reported out by Dr. Mia Torchetti from NVSL at the NPIP Biennial Conference this summer. And I thought there was some interesting information, and so I included it in full, and I'll kind of walk through each bullet here just to kind of help better understand a little bit more about this particular virus. So the B313 virus genotype is found in dairy cattle, first emerged in wild birds in the fall of 2023. And it was likely just a single spillover event that occurred in late winter of 2023. And then there was some likely local circulation, which preceded the first evidence of cattle falling ill, which was reported back in January and February of 2024. There are a small number of molecular markers identified within these virus populations that have the potential to lead to changes in how that virus behaves and its transmission potential in mammals. And I think that's pretty evident by, what we're seeing with how readily transmittable this virus seems to be, and the other spillover events that we're seeing in mammals and even into some people. Just like in poultry populations, the continued transmission of H5N1 within dairy cattle increases the risks for infections and subsequent spread. And this is part of the reason why, even with our low pathogenic avian influenza viruses, we try not to let those viruses spread from flock to flock for risk of that virus changing and becoming more virulent. USDA Wildlife Services did conduct some enhanced spring surveillance in April, May, and June of 2024. And they looked at various wildlife species like raptors, peri-domestic birds, and the removals that the agency does of of those peri-domestic animals. And they found that less than 1% of those sampled had H5N1 detections, and there was no B313 among the 5,000 samples that they tested. So I think that's just more evidence that the virus, this B313 virus, is not circulating wildly in our wildlife populations, at least at that time. Surveillance and migratory waterfowl for these agencies, and that includes wildlife services and our local DNRs, begins at the end of summer after breeding season. And I know that effort is ongoing right now. I'm seeing a few reports from NVSL coming through across my desk for wildlife. And for the most part, we're not seeing any evidence of high path viruses at all, much less these B313. So I think, fingers crossed, maybe that's a little bit of optimism for the fall season here. We'll see what happens. But that testing was done pretty early in the season as well. So please take that information with a grain of salt, and don't let your guard down. So, there's still the question about how our poultry flocks are contracting this HPAI virus from dairy cattle. What we do know is that poultry are very susceptible to high path influenza viruses in general. They require a very small viral load in order to infect a flock, and that those dairy cattle shed very large amounts of the H5N1 virus particles in their milk. And what we don't know still is how that virus is getting into the barns. And so in Minnesota, we've got some strong epi links between some farms indicating that the virus may have moved from dairy to dairy and then dairy to poultry, potentially while spreading manure. And although the studies show that manure itself is not a likely route of viral shedding, it's very likely that some untreated waste milk or wastewater is disposed of within those manure pits and is spread out within those manure spreading operations. In some other states, employees on poultry farms were found to have second jobs on dairy farms or be in living situations with workers from other poultry and dairy farms, and that potentially could be a way of that virus moving farm to farm. So when we look at the potential transmission pathways that were found through USDA's work with this particular virus, it's really not that much different than how we look at potential transmission pathways for poultry. So animal movements, so any type of animal products moving between herds, within herds, is a good way to potentially bring that virus with it. Visitors and vehicles and equipment, dairies in particular have a ton of day-to-day traffic activities across those farms, and that's just part of their normal operations to keep those businesses moving the way that they're supposed to, and all of those activities and traffic increase the risk of spreading the virus. Shared workers is another way that they have looked at. Workers may work at multiple facilities or share housing with those who work on poultry or dairy farms. And then wildlife, of course, have to play a role in transmission as well. So that H5N1 virus has been found in wildlife captured on infected farms, as well as in some domestic animals like cats. Cats in particular appear to be very susceptible to infection and might actually be kind of that canary in the coal mine with cases. And we've had some cases even in Minnesota where a dairy worker tracked the virus back to their home, and their indoor cats got very sick with the virus. So kind of the highlights of our epidemiological work is the spread of the H5N1 between states. It's obviously linked to cattle movements, but not wild bird introductions. In some states, further local spread has occurred between dairy farms, and I would fully expect that that happened in Minnesota, even though we don't have the testing to potentially back all of that up. Disease spread between premises is likely multifactorial. So there might be some direct routes of transmission or even indirect routes, and it's kind of a complicated web when we start looking at disease transmission. And for this H5N1 virus in general, whether it's in poultry or in dairy operations, biosecurity remains our key route to help limit the risk of disease spread. So in summary, this H5N1 was likely introduced into Minnesota through lactating dairy animal movement in mid to late March. We know that the amount of dairy farms that are being tested are low, and so there's a lot of probably unreported or untested herds within the state. And we still have a lot to learn about disease transmission of this particular virus. So that's what I have for the EPI. Are there any questions before I move on to other Board of Animal Health updates? Okay, hearing none. Is there anything in the chat, Peter? I can't see that right now.
There is not, so you are good to continue.
Okay, thank you. So a couple quick updates from the Board of Animal Health. So I have a little bit of good news in that Minnesota was able to self-declare freedom from high path yesterday. And that means that we fulfilled all of the necessary actions and surveillance requirements to self-declare ourselves against HPAI in poultry. So what that means is that not much, actually. It's kind of a nice declaration on paper. It doesn't change our response or actions needed at this time if we have another case. The 2022 high path outbreak is still considered ongoing within the US because other states are still experiencing cases. And so until the United States as a whole declares freedom, we can still carry on with our response efforts as before, meaning, if we have a non-negative H5 result at the Cornell Lab at the MPTL, we can move ahead with depopulation based on those results instead of needing NBSL confirmation. And then this is just a reminder to everybody that we need to continue to screen our flocks that are experiencing high mortality for high path avian influenza. And I'll talk about this in a bit. I know we've got pneumovirus circulating, and I know it's bad right now. And I'm hearing some reports of some pretty significant mortality. I just don't want us to miss high path by not testing for it. So just know that our influenza testing is covered by USDA or by the state. If you've got mortality that is reaching your threshold to do some further investigations. So please make sure that we're doing that. So, because I don't want you guys to miss out on any indemnity payments that you might be eligible for because we tested too late. Something to keep an eye on and be aware of, USDA is moving forward with an interim rule that would implement a high path avian influenza biosecurity compliance audit program. And this would require that audits be conducted for bird placements within an active control area. And this is very similar to what we have already done or had been doing since the start of this outbreak in 22. So these are those buffer zone placements audits that were being conducted usually over Microsoft Teams to make sure that those farms would be eligible for indemnity in the event that they later came down with high path avian influenza. What's new with this is that this interim rule would then also require biosecurity audits to be conducted prior to a high path infected farm being allowed to restock. And so that's something that some states had been doing, but Minnesota never required. These audits would need to be reconducted every 6 months until the state declares freedom from high path. And so if we get into an ongoing situation where we're never able to quite declare freedom like we were able to do yesterday, those audits would need to be reconducted every 6 months. And at least the initial audit for that is an in-person audit, so no Microsoft Teams for that that restock audit to be conducted. The interim rule will also incorporate an updated version of the control area audit checklist that probably some of you have at least seen because of the buffer zone placements. And I've got a draft of it, but it's still being worked on apparently by USDA. But this interim rule is expected to be in place, if not by the end of 2024, early into 2025. I am hearing that they are doing some pilots of these audits in some states, and I have requested that Minnesota be a part of that so that we can try to have as much say as we can, even if it's not a lot of say, but if we can have a little bit of say into what that final audit template looks like, I want to make sure that we take advantage of that. Okay, moving on to avian metapneumovirus. I don't need to tell anybody we have it in Minnesota. This is just a reminder of our summary of cases from when the outbreak started this spring, which was about April 19th through the end of June. We had a total of 288 prems, most of which were type A, but we had a handful of type B and a couple farms that even managed to get both A and B. And it seemed to hit just about everywhere in the state. So we had 37 counties reported at that time. It was a huge workload to try to tackle and capture all of that testing that happened during that spring outbreak. And so starting in July 1st, we did switch how we are monitoring and tracking these positive cases, and we're doing it based on an accession level instead of on a flock or a premises level. It was just too hard to know when those new flocks were coming in and if this was a new flock or an old flock being tested. And so just note that the numbers that are reported here are based on accessions. And so if that same flock or same premises is tested multiple times to try to look for progression of that virus, we're capturing it multiple times as well. So you can see this summer in July and August, we still were seeing cases, 9 PCR cases in July, 36 in August. For those who are still doing some serology, we're still picking those up. And then I believe, and you guys will probably back me up on this, that we're having a second wave of pneumovirus infections, and things seem to increase in September based off of our testing. So in September, we were only seeing type A and to date. So this was data that was pulled this morning. For October, we've had 25 PCR positives, and I suspect that number will go up depending on if people actually get diagnostic testing done. I'm only getting reports out of the labs, and this does include both our public labs as well as private labs that are reporting to us. I also want to mention, as kind of an FYI, we are seeing an unusual number of mycoplasma cases being detected in Minnesota poultry flocks. So just as a reminder, Mycoplasma gallisepticum, synoviae, and meleagritis are only reportable in the state of Minnesota if they're detected in commercial breeder flocks. And then our board rules do require that breeder flocks are quarantined and participate in an approved salvage plan or be disposed of. So we are working with any infected breeder flocks to try to mitigate that risk, whether those flocks are being disposed of or if there is a need to keep that flock on the ground. So stay tuned on this. I'm trying to figure out ways to report this information in a useful and digestible way for everybody to understand, but we are investigating each of these cases to try to understand where it's coming from and how it's spreading. And then this slide you've probably seen a number of times. This is the testing schedule at the MPTL. The MPTL is just an FYI. Nothing has changed. Avian influenza is still being conducted Monday through Friday with that cutoff time for sample drop off at 11 a.m. PCR testing for pneumovirus is still happening Monday through Friday, and they run those off of all samples that were received the day prior. And any changes to that, you need to notify the lab. Serology testing for pneumovirus is happening on Fridays. Weekend and off-cycle testing is still in place, and knowing that we're in our kind of high-risk period for influenza transmission, we are fully ready and have on-call staff available at both the VDL and the MPTL to do that emergency testing. So the VDL is still available on Saturdays for testing, with samples to be received to the lab by noon, if needed. And Sunday is at the MPTL. All off-cycle and weekend testing needs to be arranged through me. So my number is up here on the screen, and I'll show you it in a bigger here. And then I will work with Dr. Nikery or Stacey Pollack to arrange for that testing at the appropriate lab. And that is what I have for updates today. Are there any questions?
All right, thank you, Dr. Voss. It doesn't look like we have any questions, which gives us about 5 minutes before we got to jump off. I want to remind everyone that the bird control group does have a webinar at 1 o'clock to discuss the Minnesota Protect grant, as well as how lasers can be used to protect your flocks from migratory birds. So if you're not registered for that, please register and sign up. The deadline for the Protect grant is coming up. It is October 31st. So if you have not yet applied and are wanting to, you need to get on that. I believe Abby Schuff with the U of M is willing to help write those grants if you need any assistance. You can also talk to Brandon at the MTGA office. He will also assist in looking over your grant proposals. But with no further questions, I want to thank everyone for joining. And once again, this will be on our website. Thank you.